When you see the term magical realism, you might think of a particular author or director. Or, if you're like me, you might think of fantasy and then get really confused because a story is either fantasy or it's real, but seldom can it be both. They're somewhat mutually exclusive genres, fantasy and realism. Or at least that was my perception. One of the most well-known authors to use magical realism is Gabriel Garcia-Marquez, and to my great fortune, his book, Chronicle of a Death Foretold, was my first encounter with the genre. Chronicle of a Death Foretold is one of the author's more restrained works. Examples of magical realism from the book include, he dreamed he was alone in a tinfoil airplane and flying through the almond trees without bumping into anything. And when you listened with the stethoscope, you could hear the tears bubbling inside his heart. In both instances, a reader could misconstrue these as clever imagery. It's only in being familiar with some of Marquez's other works that it becomes recognizable as magical realism. That's why A Chronicle of a Death Foretold is such a good starting point for the genre. Marquez's equivalent on film is probably Guillermo Del Toro, whose most prominent work is Pan's Labyrinth, which is at the other end of the spectrum. Whereas A Chronicle of a Death Foretold is nuanced and often occupies some sort of middle ground between the magical and real world, Pan's Labyrinth makes it very plain when the film is in the magical world and when it's in the real world. When Ophelia crosses over into the fairy world, there is very little of the real world in it, and when she is in the real world, it is undoubtedly post-Spanish Civil War Spain. There is very little gray area in the film. J.A. Bayona's A Monster Calls occupies the space in between. The real world in A Monster Calls is much more timeless than in Pan's Labyrinth. This world is obviously similar to present day, but there's no clear dating, and no clear historical reference points. As far as the magical world is concerned, there's no clear division between the real and the magical. As in A Chronicle of a Death Foretold, they're interwoven. It's not until later that it becomes clear that 1207 is where the transition occurs. Even without realizing this, however, it is still abundantly clear that the monster comes from and adheres to the rules of the magical world. That's not to say that A Monster Calls does not differentiate two worlds like in Pan's Labyrinth. It does. When the audience first enters Connor's head, the film transitions from live action to animation. Over the course of the film, this division begins to dissolve. The second time Connor enters into his headspace, he and the monster enter into the animated, imagined world. And once they leave, the consequences of their actions leave with them. By the third time, the animated has given way to photorealism. Connor's imagined world has become its own version of reality. In this way, there are really three worlds: the real, the magical, and the imagined. It's the last scene, however, that solidifies A Monster Calls as magical realism. Up until this point, the monster could just as easily be a part of Connor's imagination. But being given his mother's sketchbook, we see that his mother has also had experiences with this same monster. Thus, the monster is magical, not imaginary, and as a result, A Monster Calls has earned its place in magical realism. Thanks again for watching. I knew going into this that A Chronicle of a Death Foretold wasn't going to have a lot of footage, so I had to think of something creative to solve that dilemma. Once I recorded it, I knew that this was going to be one of my shorter videos and therefore potentially easier to edit, so I thought I'd try a new technique with stop motion. I think it turned out relatively well and it was a lot of fun to try. Tune in next time. Thanks.